I'm going to hand over to Warren.
Thanks so much, Andy. Good evening, everybody. Hello and welcome. Just adding my own welcome to this public theology lecture. And it's great to be doing this in partnership with St Bride's Liverpool, Heart Edge and Open Table Liverpool. So my name's Warren Hartley and I'm the LGBTQIA ministry facilitator at St Bride's. And I'm privileged to be part of the team which leads the Open Table community which gathers at St Bride's. Open Table, for those of you who haven't heard of it, is a network of worship communities which offer a warm welcome and an affirmation to people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, and anybody else you care to name, and all who seek an inclusive church. And there we aim to create a safe, sacred space for folk to explore their faith, what it means for them. And so tonight I want to offer that unreserved Open Table and St Bride's welcome to you. So whoever you are, wherever you come from, you are welcome here. The St Bride's Public Theology Lecture Series has been going for well over a decade now, bringing nationally renowned theologians and philosophers and thinkers to Liverpool to deliver papers from the cutting edge of thought about the divine and our world. And through the wonders of Zoom and partnership with Heart Edge, we can share these to an even bigger audience. It's a true pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Savitri Hensman, especially with it being LGBT+ History Month. LGBT+ History Month is organised by Skills Out UK, which is a campaigning group for LGBT+ people in education. It's been going since 2004. And it's a chance to celebrate the lives and achievements of LGBT people from the past and present. Each year, the festival takes a theme from the education curriculum, and this year's theme is Body, Mind and Spirit. In the United Kingdom, it's celebrated in February each year, and that marks the anniversary of the abolition of Section 28 in 2003. Tonight's speaker, Savi, is a Sri Lankan-born writer, activist and involvement coordinator based in London, and worked for London's Black, Lesbian and Gay Centre in the 1980s and 90s. She's an associate of Ecclesia who published her book, Sexuality, Struggle and Saintliness, Same-Sex Love and the Church. She's also written for The Guardian, The Independent, Church of England newspaper and Via Media, as well as writing poetry. Savi is a gifted writer and speaker and someone whom I've had the pleasure of meeting and hearing numerous times. Savi, you possess a very rare and wonderful gift for communicating clearly and calmly and intelligently in conversations that usually don't have those hallmarks. And I delight in reading your work, as I never fail to come away without thinking, I hadn't thought of it that way before. So tonight's lecture is Church, LGBTI+ Equality and the Priesthood of All Believers. Savi will explore the concept of the church as a movement or community rather than a collection of institutions, and its members' parts in the shifts in attitudes and practice in church and society. Thank you to Miranda Threlfall-Holmes, who's the team rector of St Bride's, who will help host the Q&A later on. So welcome, Savi, and welcome everybody to this lecture. Over to you, Savi.
Thank you very much for inviting me today. Can you hear me clearly? Great. Over the past century, views among Christians in the UK and many other countries on same-sex love and LGBTQI+ inclusion have changed radically. In some cases, churches have changed their practices, for instance, celebrating same-gender marriages or making it easier to appoint ministers who are transgender. But even in those which are officially non-affirming, the practice on the ground is often different, though some people still have extremely unpleasant experiences within churches. And church leaders often send out very negative or confusing signals. Most Christians here don't see same-sex intimacy as necessarily wrong, and plenty live out their sexuality and gender identity confidently and joyfully, or support family, friends and neighbours to do so. And many of us will have experienced in our own lifetimes something of that shift. Sometimes this is presented as a case of Christians following cultural trends or setting modern knowledge above the Bible and tradition, whether rightly or wrongly. For instance, a Church of England pamphlet on grace and disagreement from 2014, which claims that the last half century has seen the fragmentation of what once seemed to be enduring social norms. The fact of rapid social change does not entail that the church must change its teaching. Social change does, however, change the relationship of the church and its teaching to the surrounding culture. There are plenty of precedents for the church standing out against cultural trends which seem remote from the gospel, and there are many instances where the church has found that new cultural patterns can reflect God's will and God's love. Now, this is an attempt to be balanced, but I certainly found that puzzling in a historical sense. Not only does it blot out the theological shift in the previous half century, so that by 1970, an official Church of England working party was divided on whether same-sex partnerships were always wrong, though the report of that working party was not published at that time. But it also raises a question: how come in countries where a high proportion of the population is Christian, cultural change could have sneaked up on the church so unexpectedly? As a Sri Lankan lesbian, now in my late 50s, who's been involved in various kinds of activism in church and society, as well as writing about change, I'm aware this tends to involve a lot of hard work and very often a lot of public arguing. So why didn't they notice? What's more, though economic and technological change have contributed to weakening traditional patterns of family life, and the notion that having lots of babies is the best defense against the risk of whole populations dying out, for instance through plagues, is no longer the case, there are plenty of societies across the world where, in earlier times, same-sex intimacy and gender diversity were accepted. And some expressions of modernity involve stamping out difference rather than welcoming it, or a consumerist focus rather than on valuing love and mutual respect. So there is nothing automatic about cultural trends having led to the changes that we've seen in opinion in the churches. There's a different tendency also to focus on LGBTI plus history and the church in terms of either being excluded or struggles for inclusion. And these are indeed important. For instance, in a message from the Archbishops of Canterbury and York this year, just a couple of weeks ago, I think, which I think Warren will put up on the screen. And this, sorry, I think I might have got the order wrong. Let's see that. Anyway, according to this message, actually, I may not. Sorry, I may not even have put it up. Or may not have even put it up, but some of you will have read it. Across the United Kingdom for a number of years, the Archbishops wrote, February has been associated with LGBT plus History Month, and many throughout our parishes up and down the country will be marking this. LGBT plus History Month is about acknowledging and learning from past hurt and building a society where LGBT people can and must live their lives free from hate and violence. We welcome this observation of the place and contribution of LGBT people in our society and in our church and assure people of our prayers. Like many, I think this message from the Archbishops is a welcome step and would like more action to back it up. But that's not the whole story. We're far from being just victims, and there's much to celebrate in terms of how LGBTI plus Christians have contributed to the life of the church as a whole. And in LGBTI plus History Month, it's a fitting time maybe to refer back to some of what's been happening, particularly over the past century. I will take a quick look at a few historical figures who reflect a far wider number of Christians who've been involved alongside people of all faiths and none in changing society and the church. Sometimes this has been at very local level within their own friendship networks, within their own neighborhoods. And that's been important, word of mouth, personal influence and example. That's been a crucial aspect of change. Sometimes it's been on a far wider scale. But this involves people in various walks of life, clergy included. And today I apologize for the many, many other people whom I won't mention. And if I appear to be shoehorning people born in the 19th or early 20th century into the main present day categories of sexuality and gender identity, it is sometimes difficult to find an accurate description for people who may have been born in an earlier era, and there may be a certain element of guesswork, partly because a lot of people lived in social situations where either the language and terminology was different, or levels of social exclusion made it much harder for people to be out and to explore who they were, often both. I'll also focus on one or two countries which are English speaking, which makes my task easier since this is the only language I speak fluently. But similar trends have been going on in various other parts of the world, in other languages, in other spaces. And I think there's much that maybe historians have yet to uncover or pull together. But first, what do I mean by the church? When we speak of churches, occasionally this refers to buildings, but usually it refers to organizations or networks. But I would distinguish this from the church as a community across time and space, which tries to reflect and work for personal and collective transformation. It can be confusing because very often church leaders will mention that the church includes people, that it's about people, it's about community, that it includes lay people and not just clergy. And then they'll go on to describe the church or church activities as solely activities that maybe they're influencing or running, or that they're aware of, or that are tied into formal church institutions. So this confusion on the part of non-Christians is easily pardoned, since I think there can be mixed messages sent out by church leaders. I have flagged up an important statement from the World Council of Churches on baptism, Eucharist and ministry in 1982, which some of us will be old enough to remember, was something of a breakthrough in bringing together the understanding of many different churches about some key aspects of who Christians were and what we might be able to do together, what beliefs we might have in common. Though the Roman Catholic Church isn't an official member of the World Council of Churches, it's also been part of that broader dialogue about the church, which is mentioned as a new community in which all members are called to confess their faith and to give account of their hope. They are to identify with the joys and sufferings of all people as they seek to witness in caring love. The members of Christ's body are to struggle with the oppressed towards that freedom and dignity promised with the coming of the kingdom. The church as a whole can be described as a priesthood. All members are called to offer their being as a living sacrifice and to intercede for the church and the salvation of the world. In some churches, there are people known as priests who support this wider priesthood, for instance, within the Church of England. Former Archbishop of Canterbury in the Church of England, the late Michael Ramsey, an eminent theologian and church leader, wrote a book, The Christian Priest Today, with useful advice for the clergy and to some extent the wider laity, that is the people who make up most church members, though the term laity may sometimes refer to the clergy as well, a wider body of the church, the people who make up the church, urging them to take up their share in the task of Christian people to study together and form right judgments based on knowledge and Christian insight. And he advises priests that it may often be for them to rouse the laity to think responsibly about these questions. He was referring to some of the burning social issues of the day. But when they are aroused, you will find that they have knowledge which you have not, and you will be learning from them in a partnership of Christian concern. This is how the mind of the church is to be formed. Hence, it's not just a matter of bishops or other clergy who come up with what the church thinks about one issue or another. So for Christians, the church is an us, not a them. When I was growing up, I would say that family and friends and congregation members whom I knew, as well as worship, prayer, and personal experience, and stories which engaged me of people past and present, did more to shape my understanding of faith than the words of archbishops or the resolutions of councils, though of course these are connected. And for many of us, our most vivid experience of church is still very much those around us, those who somehow touch our lives, though there may also be a sense of strong connection with people in the past, with those with whom we may feel united in prayer, with people who have died, with people many, many miles away. So there can be that sense of connection beyond our immediate circles, but it's certainly not just a hierarchical institution where our formation as Christians, our gradual development of a sense of what our faith means to us is just dictated by what somebody important or supposedly important says. Today, I'll look at three possible strands of that change in attitudes and practice around sexuality and gender identity. Firstly, developments in the theology around these from the early 20th century. Secondly, the activity of Christians seeking justice, equality, and human rights alongside people of goodwill of other faiths and none, which have helped to create a climate enabling acceptance. And thirdly, making of a case specifically to affirm and celebrate LGBTI plus love and identity as fully compatible with our Christian faith. I recognise that not all who oppose discrimination are fully affirming, but that has created space for respect and openness so that people can draw conclusions on who we are and the gifts we bring on the basis of that rather than on fear and stereotypes. In the early 20th century, there was widespread negativity among Christians worldwide, and colonialism may have had something to do with exporting certain fairly negative views or making those more uniform in Christian communities in various parts of the world, though not everybody would necessarily have accepted all that they were told. And it was why I think there was a wide view about the right way of being men and women, and we had to fit into certain categories of rigid gender binaries, and of sexual intimacy being confined to heterosexual marriage. There are a number of norms that society had that Christians tended to hold. Yet in 1914, amidst upheaval in Russia, in Europe and beyond, The Pillar and Ground of the Truth was written by the Russian Orthodox scientist, priest and mystic Pavel Florensky. He was gay himself, though he got married as was expected at that time. And in this, he drew heavily on the Bible and church tradition, including ancient ceremonies for marking same-sex friendship. He made a powerful case for valuing same-sex love and intimacy, underlining the importance of one-to-one relationships for the wider love of others and spiritual growth. As hostility to the church grew around him, he ended up in Siberia, where he ministered to his fellow prisoners, and eventually he was martyred. But it's harder to kill ideas. It was, however, quite a while before his key writings were translated and his theological influence more widely felt. Meanwhile, the idea of universal human rights had for quite a while been gaining ground internationally. Putting it into practice was proving harder. A major development in 1924 was when the League of Nations agreed the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, which led later to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. A key drafter and champion was an English woman, Eglantine Jebb, who has found herself onto the Church of England liturgical calendar, and whose efforts were very much driven by her faith, whether she was being arrested for protesting against the blockade after World War I, which led to starvation among children of the so-called enemy, or founding Save the Children to reach out to those affected by extreme poverty and hardship across the world, having initially engaged with poverty and suffering on her doorstep in the UK itself. She was faced with poor health and repeated misfortune in love with both women and men. Nevertheless, her humanity and persuasiveness had huge results, and also contributed to what might be regarded as a culture of rights, that notion of people having hold an obligation on their fellow humans, and us all have an obligation to help others in need, and the state states to work together for that end. Just a few years later, an English Roman Catholic novelist who often drew on religious themes managed to get furious debate going in society and the church and the wider sense of the Christian community. Despite society's disapproval of lesbianism, Radcliffe Hall didn't hide her identity, which had some aspects in common with those of trans men and non-binary people. She could have stayed relatively safe, like others of her class. She was from an upper-class background. But her 1928 novel, The Well of Loneliness, was written with the aim of exposing the cruelty of prejudice against those who might today be classified as LGBT+, but also conveying that this diversity was part of the nature that God created. The novel was banned, yet change was underway in terms of popular culture and in terms of thinking among Christians as well as their neighbours. In 1940, English Anglican writer and theologian Archibald Kenneth Ingram, a barrister by training who was employed by the Ministry of Labour, wrote that love, and usually love of the most complete kind, is the substance of the vast majority of homosexual relationships. And where the love is sincerely mutual, it is immoral to devalue it. In his 1944 booklet, Christianity and Sexual Morality, he argued for an ethic based on love, understood not as temporary infatuation, but rather as a deeper, usually faithful relationship, in which the beloved is treated as a person, not an object for one's own gratification. So he began to lay the foundations for an approach to the theology of sexuality that was not based on male-female couples or perhaps the more conventional notions, but which looked deeper into what made actions moral or immoral. Over the quarter century that followed, there was more affirming theology gradually, as it became apparent that the Bible and tradition were not as clear as some had thought in terms of their attitudes. And internationally, colonialism, racism, and wider economic and social injustice were being challenged in church and society, which also meant looking again at some of the norms that people had taken for granted. Also in 1940, over in the USA, Paulie Murray, an African-American activist in an era of segregation, was arrested for refusing to move to the back of a bus. But she's perhaps best known as Murray's perhaps best known as a brilliant legal scholar who played a part in successfully overturning US laws allowing racist and sexist discrimination. A lesbian, trans man, or maybe non-binary, Murray's identification would to some extent shift in the course of quite a long and fruitful life. Murray would much later become an Anglican priest and theologian, writing then, "Now I was empowered to minister the sacrament of one in whom there is no north or south, no black or white, no male or female, only the spirit of love and reconciliation drawing us all towards the goal of human wholeness." Murray's friend, Eleanor Roosevelt, an American Anglican from a leading political family, had a deep-rooted faith which was intertwined with practice. As she'd written in 1932, "The thing which counts is the striving of the human soul to achieve spiritually the best that it is capable of, and to care unselfishly not only for personal good, but for the good of all those who toil with them upon the earth." In 1948, she enabled people of many nations, cultures, and outlooks to cooperate to produce a universal Declaration of Human Rights. She was lesbian or perhaps bisexual. Some of the controversies around justice, equality, and morality were being played out by that time in formal discussions and debates within national churches, denominations, and bodies such as the World Council of Churches. By the 1950s, Church of England leaders were joining in moves towards partially decriminalising sex between men in England and Wales, achieved in 1967, though it took longer in Scotland and Northern Ireland, though this still tended to be viewed as sinful. But in the mid-1960s, religious figures, such as leading Methodist Donald Soper, were questioning whether same-sex love was necessarily wrong. The 60s was a decade of turmoil as numerous people across the world struggled for a better and more humane world, while debating how this could best be achieved. Bayard Rustin, a black Quaker who was openly gay at a time when this could mean arrest, quite apart from stigma, was a key figure in the civil rights movement, which gained international publicity, championing non-violent direct action and working closely with Martin Luther King Jr. to organize the 1963 March on Washington. And he was somebody who showed considerable boldness in his life, something that may be a theme for some Christians once convinced of the rightness of a path that may lead to liberation and justice. By then, another African-American gay man who had lived for years in Paris was exploring, in novels sold in many countries, as well as through essays and talks, issues such as race and sexuality. James Baldwin, who'd been a child preacher, had a sometimes fraught relationship with mainstream Christianity, yet time and again he returned to theological themes in various aspects of his work, in particular love and truth, in their personal and social dimensions. At a World Council of Churches gathering in Sweden in 1968, he spoke on white racism or world community, sparking much soul-searching and a determination to tackle injustice. So at that time, many Christians were influencing some of these struggles, though there were also Christians who were organizing to oppose greater justice and equality. The church was divided, using the church in that broadest sense, and there were non-Christians as well who played an important part within those movements. But I think that contribution of Christians, including Christians who are LGBTI+, shouldn't be underestimated. In 1969, one of the young people growing up amidst a ferment of ideas and activism in the USA was 17-year-old Silvia Rivera, a trans woman of Puerto Rican and Venezuelan descent, who was raised by a grandmother who beat her, ending up selling sex on the streets to survive. She was one of those who fought back against police repression at the Stonewall Inn that year, which would inspire LGBTI+ campaigners across the world. She also protested against the Vietnam War, was involved with radical Puerto Rican and Black groups, became active in the Metropolitan Community Church of New York, which helped run a food pantry for the poor, and continued to organize especially for the rights of trans people and a better deal for homeless LGBT+ youth. On the other side of the Atlantic, a Scottish-born senior civil servant was beginning to tackle discrimination at work in his workplace, part of a wider move to challenge much of the prejudice and unfair treatment that so many LGBTI+ people were facing, especially in an era before any protective laws. Though gay sex had been decriminalised south of the border, gays were still treated as a security risk, especially if they were diplomats, and generally LGBTI+ people as potentially rather dubious characters, maybe not the ones one would expect to have responsible positions. But Ian Buist was unwilling to hide who he was, and won the backing not only of managers, but also in the 1970s, his trade union, after a lot of hard work in terms of changing hearts and minds, winning support for equality. He also joined what was then the lesbian and gay Christian movement and was particularly active in changing views in Reformed churches. Some activists have been at work both in wider society and in the church. And in the church more narrowly, i.e. within Christian institutions. In the 1970s, there were growing numbers of theologians who were producing affirming theology. Churches were increasingly formally wrestling with issues, though focusing usually more on sexuality than gender identity. That took longer, I think, for those discussions to get off the ground, and in some churches they haven't really got very far. Though there was still a huge reluctance on the part of leaders to move forward very far, even if in private they might admit that people calling for change had a strong case. Prejudice was still a major problem, and Bunny Jones, a straight black Christian wife and mother in the USA with gay friends at work, decided to do something about it. So she penned lyrics to a song, found someone to set it to music, but then had to find a singer. And I think I've got the date wrong. I think in the mid-1970s, Born This Way was released, sung by Charles Valentino Harris, who'd been a veteran of Stonewall and appeared in musicals, I think. And then, 3 years later, with Motown backing, the song became a hit, a club hit, sung by the openly gay gospel singer Carl Bean, who later became a minister of religion. I think he's now a bishop or archbishop. So clubgoers were dancing away to lyrics such as "I'm happy, I'm carefree, and I'm gay. Now I won't judge you, don't you judge me. And you call me strange because you don't understand God's role for me in life's overall plan." A little bit of theology set to music, and for those who aren't familiar with it, you can always go off and dig it up later and play it to yourself. But this was a time when attitudes were changing, and some Christians were playing their part in that. Another talented black singer had been rejected by the Pentecostal church of his childhood, but remained a committed Christian, finding an inclusive church in which to worship. The songs of Sylvester James, better known as just Sylvester, became the soundtrack for many as they were coming out, while his visibility made it easier for us to be ourselves. So there was an increasingly visible, occasionally diverse, and sometimes organised LGBTI+ Christian presence in various countries by the late 70s and early to mid 80s. Simon and Cooley was a member of an LGBTI+ Christian group, this time in South Africa, but that's not what he's famous for. In 1984, at the age of 27, along with 21 other political leaders, he was charged and tried for treason by the apartheid regime. It took years before he was freed and cleared. The contribution of people who are LGBTI+ within the liberation struggle played a part in post-apartheid South Africa adopting advanced pro-equality laws and shifting perceptions within the church. Archbishop Desmond Tutu would become one of the most prominent allies and has been a strong advocate for greater equality. I could go on all evening, but I hope by now I've shown why I think that notion that cultural change was some kind of process completely separate from the church in the widest sense, the church as a community, just doesn't hold water in terms of the historical reality. Christians, alongside people of other faiths and none, yet led in part by their faith, and energized and inspired, have been active in changes in thinking and practice, leading to greater LGBTI+ inclusion within the churches and far beyond. Also, while churches as institutions often have a miserable track record on LGBTI+ equality, for the church in a wider sense, there's a fair deal to celebrate this month, LGBTI+ History Month, in terms of looking at that wider church community contribution to equality. There is also much to repent of in terms of attitudes and failures at grassroots as well as a top leadership level. How might we describe this in theological language? I'll turn briefly to a couple of documents in recent years from the Roman Catholic Church, which is often perceived as one of the most top-down denominations in terms of its thinking, as well as very hard to shift at the upper levels on issues of sexuality and gender, though in the past decades divisions have become apparent and more church leaders are being clearer about their support for greater inclusion. The first is from 2014 on a concept used by other churches too, using the Latin term sensus fidei, the sense of the faith, not just about popular opinion, the greatest number of people who think something, but about a kind of ability among the faithful when they're rooted in the church and alert to the Spirit to discern what's right and good. So this describes about how by the gift of the Holy Spirit, all of the baptized participate in the prophetic office of Jesus Christ, the faithful and true witness, and how this also how the faithful have an instinct for the truth of the gospel, which enables them to recognize and endorse authentic Christian doctrine and practice, and reject what's false. The sensus fidei. In certain areas, it goes on, the teaching of the church has developed as a result of lay people discovering the imperatives arising from new situations. The reflection of theologians and then the judgment of the episcopal magisterium was based on the Christian experience already clarified by the faithful intuition of lay people. It also states, it is natural for the priesthood of the people to find expression in a multitude of ways. The second is from a document which Pope Francis came up with last year, which draws on and takes forward Catholic social teaching, which overlaps with that of many other churches, and encourages Christians to reach out and work with others for a more caring and just world. Each day offers us a new opportunity, a new possibility. We should not expect everything from those who govern us, but that would be childish. We have the space we need for co-responsibility in creating and putting into place new processes and changes, he wrote. Differences of colour, religion, talent, place of birth or residence, and so many others cannot be used to justify the privileges of some over the rights of all. As a community, we have an obligation to ensure that every person lives with dignity. He also wrote about diversity, using the image of a polyhedron, which can represent a society where differences coexist, complementing, enriching, and reciprocally illuminating one another, even amid disagreements and reservations. And returned again to that theme he often has about how sometimes the marginalized have much to teach. This also means finding ways to include those on the peripheries of life, but they have another way of looking at things. They see aspects of reality that are invisible to the centers of power where weighty decisions are made. So, to conclude, perhaps Christians might describe this historical journey over the past century or so towards a place of greater love, justice, and mutual inclusion for LGBTI plus people as one that has been guided by the Holy Spirit, and a quest for truth, informed by the Bible, tradition, reason, and experience. In this, it might be said, church members in different countries, some LGBTI plus ourselves, others not, as part of a community of hope, a priesthood responding to the joys and sufferings of all people, especially those who are oppressed, and seeking to witness in caring love, have worked towards that freedom and dignity for all, which is a sign of God's realm or commonwealth on earth as in heaven. In society and our faith community, it might be said that we've taken responsibility rather than just relying on the powerful, even where this has involved risk and sacrifice, resulting in changes in theological thinking, in the wider culture, and in time in church's official teaching and practice, though this is still a work in progress. Thank you. Over to questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Savi. I'm just going to, I've got a couple of questions to pass on to you. If anyone else has a question and would like to ask it, then if you either go to the participants list and at the bottom you'll see the option to raise your hand, or you could type it into the questions now. Savi, I've been asked one question. Someone's messaged me and asked me to ask on their behalf. For your thoughts on last week's news reports about Nigel Farage, among others, campaigning for the removal from the UK statute book of all the human rights legislation that was won while we were in the EU with the help of the ECG, which the person who asks is very concerned about and wondered what your perspective on that might be. Sorry if that's a bit left field.
Yes, I think it's worrying. It will take a long time to push back because there is a strong structure of human rights. But I think that at the moment in this country, there are risks of a kind of populism that might pick off different minorities and undermine rights under the guise of patriotism, nationalism, discarding what's right on. And I think that there can be a weakness where Christians may see a Christian identity as separate from the work that's being done on endorsing and supporting human rights. Now, the Anglican Communion, for instance, endorsed the UN Declaration when it was still in development before it was finally agreed. I think that, and there was an Anglican at the centre of that process. But very often, the language of rights or whatever is portrayed as something separate from Christian thinking, and sometimes Christian thinking is being hijacked, or that notion of a Christian nation being hijacked in the UK, in other parts of Europe, as being sometimes about being a white nation, certainly about being a nation which underplays various kinds of equality, particularly LGBTI plus equality, sometimes gender equality, though that varies. So I think that it will take a lot of hard work to undermine. And of course, the UK leaders have played an important part of the international framework of the development of human rights. But again, a lack of knowledge, of historical knowledge of who did what towards building that framework and how it's made a difference, even if it's often not observed, means that it's that much more fragile.
There's a question from Helen King in the comments. Helen, do you want to unmute yourself and ask that question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. No, Savia, I was really struck by that. Thank you. You taught me lots of things I didn't know. I really like that slide about the Roman Catholic Church and about the role of the faithful in discerning that some sort of change is necessary, the faithful laity. And I just wondered how you think that plays out in the Church of England at the moment, where the bishops do seem to be running the show.
Yes, I think that the bishops in the Church of England for a while adopted this notion that that their teaching office meant that they should be able to teach about almost everything, and that per se being bishops meant that they were experts in anything and everything. But clearly this is there would be a certain element of magical thinking there, whether it's how deep to sink the foundations from a new building to what is the best way forward, what are the permutations around different aspects of human identity. There is no reason to suppose that they hold that knowledge on their own. So that notion, I was looking just the other day at a copy of Doctrine in the Church of England. This is a report from I think a commission appointed in 1922, but it actually reported, I think, in 1938. So when we come to the bit about the church, it reads, the church's understanding of the gospel is continually renewed by its experience of communion with God through Christ, and the authority of its doctrinal formulations ought always to be interpreted as resting, at least in part, upon the acceptance of these by the whole body of the faithful. This authority, insofar as it is derived from such a consensus fidelium, rests upon the range and quality of the manifold experience which that consensus gathers up, and upon the witness which, alike in the devotional and other practice of Christians generally, and in the doctrine of the theologians, it bears to the truth of the gospel. Basically, it accepts that authority cannot reside solely in the leadership, and I think the leadership has found that at a practical level, for instance, in I think the rather dire 2017 document that it tried to put forward and which was given a strong fail by General Synod, it hasn't necessarily worked to push this through. But at the same time, I think there is quite a long way to go, because there is still, I think, an element of the feudal culture and of the managerialism that doesn't listen properly, or listens to people who are thought to be powerful and important, which is in some ways is even worse, while not listening necessarily to many people who have a different experience, and indeed not listening adequately to the sizable majority of Church of England members.
I wonder if I can ask Savi. I encourage other people to ask more questions. I think people are all struck dumb. But if I can ask, if you could say a little bit more about what it says about our theology of the laity and our theology of ordination, where we have this kind of two-tier system where it's kind of just about acceptable to be in a same-sex partnership and a same-sex marriage if you're laity, but not if you're ordained, which, if we believe in a priesthood of all believers, doesn't seem to make any sense at all.
Yes, I mean, I think that it doesn't, and there's a serious problem within it. I mean, I can see that there may be that worry because priests are seen as more representative, and there may be public relations issues, especially if we go back a few decades. Not that that's always not that that's a particularly good way to lead churches, but I think, I mean, there are varying views around the role of the priesthood, but surely for me, part of being a priest means bringing your experience as a layperson, as part of that community of faith, into that practice, into supporting other people in taking up their experience as Christians. So if you're continually living a pretense of who you are, or living at half speed, so to speak, because you've got to suppress a sizable aspect of yourself, or cut yourself off from the roots of the sport that could enable you to be to lead a deeper, more spiritual life, to love more authentically, that seriously interferes with your ability to relate in an authentic way to the people around you and bear authentic witness to what it means to you to be a Christian, if you're encouraging other people to do that as well. So I think there's there's a serious misunderstanding if there's a notion that clergy are people who could be cut off from that aspect of themselves. And actually, this is something the Church of England tackled some centuries ago, when there was that push for clergy to be able to marry, because it was recognised as something that was important, and it took a lot of doing and a lot of pushing back against it. That it was not just about having a mistress on the side, but about treating somebody with respect if you're entering into that relationship with them, and trying to model in that relationship what it means to love in a one-to-one sense, as well as supporting one another in loving more widely. So I think, yes, I think there are a lot of gaps around in terms of theology of the laity, and a lot of the time it may just stop at the clergy should encourage the laity to do more tasks around within churches, like whether it's administrative tasks or others. But there's some much deeper issues, and yes, that gap is and the different rules, which sometimes affect licensed lay ministers as well, are unhelpful and unhealthy, I'd say.
It's a really interesting point. I don't think I've ever seen any discussion of the historic debates about clergy being allowed to marry, being referenced in this area. That's a really interesting point. Thank you so much for that. There's a question here from if people could just make sure that they're on mute, because occasionally it flicks on to somebody else, that'll be great. It's a question here from Roach, is that how you say that? As a young Catholic in Germany, I'm questioning how the lay believers could be or get trained in feeling able to feel not quite. Would you like to ask that question yourself, Roach?
I'm not sure if my English is good enough. I couldn't describe it good enough that you could understand, I think. I'm asking how lay people can be trained to do more action and not to have fear, because they are not enough.
Okay, so it's about how laity can be trained. Are you asking how laity can be trained to have the confidence to challenge clergy?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I am convinced that all people are in the priesthood, but I'm not able to do this because I learned as a child the priest is much higher than me. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, I think that it is it can be a challenge, and if you get some priests who are either very used to working in authoritarian ways, or they feel very fragile about their authority being challenged, it may be sometimes safer not to, or to sidestep that. But it's not, again, that isn't a particularly healthy situation in terms of bringing out the different gifts that people have. I think it's something that maybe we can encourage one another in, and look at ways in terms of those surrounding us to help us get that confidence about speaking up where in spaces where we think it would be productive and where we don't think that the end results would be too damaging. I think it's saying that different people are in different kinds of places. I think there's also that area of gaining the theological knowledge that we might need, and some of us may have quite a lot in particular fields because we've been reading about it, because it's something that affects us personally, or we've talked to a lot of people and thought about issues a lot. So it's being able to articulate that, but also draw on maybe what others have done. So I think it's a good question, and maybe it's for something we can all go away and think about, how we can create spaces where we can encourage and support one another. And sometimes it's about spaces where we can try things out and just explaining our point of view, maybe with somebody else replying, so we can build up our confidence before maybe challenging somebody who may be less willing to listen.
Thank you. And perhaps following on from that, someone's asked me to ask what advice you'd give to a Christian who's new to exploring affirming Christian spaces. Where would you suggest people would start, or what do you think people might find helpful to know as they begin that process?
I think that there are a lot of spaces online now. There are organisations like One Body, One Faith, which comes to mind because it's one that I've been a member of for a very long time, and been on the board of some time ago. But I mean, there are different spaces in different countries. Being part of particular affirming congregations can be helpful, but those may be places where one could get their websites or Facebook groups or other networks can supply lists of possible resources, be spaces where one could hear some of the arguments raised and some of the issues that people have talked about. There are some that focus particularly on the experience of transgender people. So for some people, those may be particularly helpful. So it's really looking around a bit at what there might be largely online or in terms of the networks, the people you know, and what makes sense for you. Because the other thing is some may focus very much on kind of evangelical theology. Some may be much more Anglo-Catholic in their approach. So it's something that resonates with you and perhaps which will help you in your own journey. Some people may think of themselves as liberal Christians, and so a different approach may work for them. So I think it's that's perhaps rather vague and general, but there is much more that's around. And if you're part of a network like Heart Edge or Open Table, that's very helpful, and there will be people there who can probably give you pointers.
Brilliant, thank you for that little plug there. Yes, have a look at the Open Table network, everyone, and see if there's an Open Table hosting church near you. Not necessarily the Open Table congregation itself even, but that's open and affirming, and welcome to that. I've just put in the comments, there's a new code. I don't know very much about this. I've just literally seen in the last day or two tweets and things about a new coalition, Mosaic, which brings together a whole range of the different organisations like One Body, One Faith and so on, which help. Warren, I don't know if you know any more about that.
I mean, I think it's worth looking out for Mosaic. I think Fiona's just flagged up Inclusive Church, so that's where worth checking out their website. They've got a list of inclusive churches. I think Mosaic brings together, yes. So that's probably quite campaigning focused, but again, it may be a source of resources and connections, and hopefully as it becomes more established, it will work to achieve change, though it focuses largely on the Church of England. So that there are also some networks that focus very much on particular churches, but in churches in the sense of denominations and networks of churches, and achieving change within those, or deepening thinking and providing mutual support.
Brilliant, thank you very much. There's quite a lot of discussion about people who know more than that by me in the comments, so thank you very much for that, everybody. Are there any more questions, comments, observations that people would like to make? I noticed Paul commenting the classic that, you know, although the church has lots of issues with LGBTQIA plus people, it's often, I've heard it said it's often harder to come out as Christian in the LGBT community than vice versa. So that's a good point, Paul. Thank you for that. Are there any other comments or questions people would like to ask? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask Savi. And
I should probably mention that there are probably quite a lot of people here who have played their own part in that change that we described today, in sort of very unnoticeable or far more noticeable ways. So it's something that has brought in a lot of people and has involved a lot of work, but at the same time it's been fascinating to be part of and fascinating to watch that process that some of us have knowledge of from the inside, and I think that where we are is perhaps a tribute to some of those who are here today, as well as maybe some of those previous speakers, people like Tina Beardsley, who have been working at these issues for a long time and haven't been totally worn out by them, and people in various denominations for whom perhaps even greater patience has been required to keep on at it, but which has actually nudged views and practice at the grassroots level forward, though there may still be a long way to go in terms of the churches as institutions.
Absolutely. Well, Savi, thank you so much for a very stimulating lecture that's been hugely interesting and has caused a huge amount of appreciation for everyone. So we really appreciate your time. It's been lovely. Thank you so much. I'm glad you haven't had all the travelling to get to Liverpool for this. It's wonderful that so many other people have been able to access this. I've put everyone in the notes at the beginning. Our next lecture, we're kind of focusing on Lent courses now. In fact, Warren has had to just go off to start the Open Table Lent course tonight. Our next lecture is going to be on Monday, May the 10th, and we've got Fergus Butler-Gailey coming to talk about God and Christianity and comedy, and the tensions around laughing at God or making jokes about God. So you might want to make a note of that date in your diary. And I've put in the links are in the chat for finding out more about Open Table, finding out more about Heart Edge, and if you'd like to, signing up for the St Bride's e-newsletter. So thank you all very much for coming. We'd like to all unmute yourselves and give Savi a chaotic Zoom round of applause.